basically what you have in the history of Thomism is you go through various waves which focus on different aspects, I guess would be the best way of putting it. So in the late medieval period, a lot of it was inner school squabbling, basically. Like when you read Capriolus or even somebody like Cayetanus, although Cayetanus, um, he doesn't fall into this as much in his commentary on the Summa, although in his Aristotelian commentaries, like this is all that he's kind of doing. But later in his life, he switches up his approach. But in that early period, it's sort of a like ordinatio format of debunk everybody and then spend 2 seconds talking about your own opinion. It was really a terrible format, and I actually despise that format of doing theology. I think that was very damaging, actually, to the way in which theology was done. But in the Baroque period, what's good about the Baroque period is you have in the Counter Reformation a desire to defend the foundations of the faith and a desire to go back to the sources. And then also a drive towards piety. So this is like the great time of the before in the golden age of scholasticism with like Bonaventure, Albertus Magnus, St. Thomas, Alexander of Hales, those you had the mystico-scholastics. The Dominican order kind of kept up the tradition of having mystico-scholastics, so mystics who were also scholastics, but it wasn't as pronounced in later periods, where it's like every story you get of Bonaventure and Thomas, it's they're literally talking with angels to to figure out questions in theology. It's kind of funny. They're literally getting visited by saints to help them, comment on certain parts of scripture or whatever. That's what's happening. And then in the second scholastic period, you have after a lot of the stuff that happens in the late medieval church that wasn't good. You have this joining of the mystic and the scholastic as two separate people, but nevertheless very connected with one another. So you have like Domingo Banez was the confessor of Saint Teresa, or Suarez. He wrote very significant works on religion, and was very erudite in mental prayer from following Saint Teresa. Those are examples. There were very pious people, especially in the Salamanca area, and they were connected with one another. Although you don't get this like jack of all trades guy like you get with St. Thomas, who's an expert in literally everything and a mystic. But there's still a very strong connection that helps out a lot. So the type of works that you get then are very erudite, very scientific, but in a certain sense, they become a little bit drier. You don't get the profound simplicity of a St. Thomas anymore, unfortunately. Although you do get certain figures like Vincent Contenson that exemplifies the same spirit as St. Thomas, while also integrating the second scholastic period stuff. So the second scholastic period, you do get the how do I put it? The most complicated. Complicated might not be the best word because complicated can have bad connotations. But you get the most erudite, I guess you could say, theological works. So they're very good with sourcing. They're very good with the distinctions, argumentation. They could be a little bit on the drier side, but nevertheless, very, very good. So when I say John of St. Thomas is better than Lagrange, it's like John of St. Thomas's works in theology, Lagrange kind of paled in comparison to them, because John of St. Thomas was writing at such a degree of complexity that Lagrange was conversant with, obviously, but he wasn't writing in that level. He was providing some sort of imitation for his own age that was meant basically for classroom use in a early 20th century Angelicum environment. Yeah, but then after the second period, you get kind of a I'm not as familiar with 17th and 18th century, but 19th and 20th century, you get another revival, which in figures like the Collegio Romano, you get the tradition of the manuals, which isn't a bad word, but they're really concerned with they're a more encyclopedic presentation, which isn't bad. Because you have certain things like Migne's um, Patrologiae, which collect all of the Greek and Latin fathers. So they're very concerned with going back to those sources. But theology in this era, unfortunately, loses a lot of its sapiential aspect, which somebody like Lagrange is actually bringing back. And you get the Second Vatican Council really emphasizing Lagrange's move back to a sapiential route. But unfortunately, thinkers like the Nouvelle Theologie, unfortunately, they kept up the historicizing tendency of some of the movements in earlier Third Scholasticism, or like pre-Third Scholasticism. So actually, people get the narrative kind of backwards. It was actually the Dominican theologians who were having a sort of ressourcement of older scholastic methods, going back to doing theology like St. Thomas did, and still concerned with positive sources, but not as obsessed with positive sources, and recognizing their sort of secondary and assisting value to doing theology. Whereas the crown of theology is scholasticism, which leads to mysticism, which is something that Garrigou was very concerned with. So it depends on what you mean by the Thomist to go to. I think that again it depends on, but the Thomist to go to, everybody knows, is St. Thomas. So